Welcome to another discussion of the Scriptures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Today we'll be talking about the book of Esther in the Old Testament. My name is Dana Pike. I'm a professor of ancient Scripture at Brigham Young University in Provo, and I'm happy to be joined today by three of my colleagues, all of whom are also in the Department of Ancient Scripture. D. Kelly Ogden, Kent Brown, and Gaye Strathearn. All professors, I should add, and brothers and sisters in the gospel. So here we are today together to talk about Esther. This is a story that many people know much about, sometimes don't know the end of the story as well, and maybe don't know the background, the setting for the story. So why don't we take a few minutes just to set the stage. Esther is an Israelite, but she doesn't live in the land of Israel. As far as we know, she never went to the land of Israel. So Kent, can you help us get started here, please?
Well, most people assume that the king mentioned here is King Xerxes.
Should we say something about his name before we get too far into this?
You mean Ahasuerus?
Ahasuerus is how you and I say it. Ahasuerus.
Xerxes.
He's typically connected with the Persian King Xerxes,
That's right.
So
That's right. And we should understand that there are other events falling around the opening of this book. A few years before, in 490 BC, that we actually know that Xerxes came to power in 486, 485. A few years earlier, in 490 BC, a grand Persian army went to Greece, was defeated at the Battle of Marathon by the Athenians and their allies, the Plataeans. 10 years later, in 480, which falls after the beginning of this book, the Persians mounted another campaign, both by sea and land, won a decisive battle at Thermopylae, which allowed them access to Athens, but then they lost a naval battle, the naval battle of Salamis, just off the coastline to the southwest of Athens, near the Isle of Salamis. And so all of these things are running around. There is mention of some sort of a major council in verse 3 of chapter 1. That may in fact have been the council which was setting in place plans to invade Greece. But all of that sort of lies around here in the background as we begin.
Xerxes the first. We're talking about the king
Xerxes
here, which is in the early 400s.
That's right. He actually comes to power in 486 and dies in 465.
all right.
That may explain, though, why we have this gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2 when Esther becomes the queen, because he's off at this battle with the Greeks, right?
Yeah.
If our reconstruction of the background is correct. Good.
In fact, chapter 2, verse 16 says, in the 7th month of his reign, that would be the year 479. So all of this is taking place after that battle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Other observations about the book of Esther before we begin?
Yeah, the book in general, there are probably more different versions, translations, manuscripts, targums, midrashes, explanations of this book in the Old Testament than any other biblical book. And it's much criticized and much condemned. In fact, it's the only book that's not even represented in all of the Dead Sea Scrolls found.
That's worth noting. We often hear that two things, that the name of God is never recorded in the book of Esther, but certainly the book presents itself that God's definitely moving in the background to bring about various events and opportunities. But two, you're right, we often hear people say that the book of Esther isn't preserved among the biblical books found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's worth noting, though, in relation to that some of the other biblical books we only have one example of, and so maybe it's just chance that this didn't survive. Maybe the people who were studying the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't feel particularly inclined towards the text. It's hard to know for sure.
But we know that Maimonides thought that next to the Pentateuch, Esther was the next one of most importance to him. So we did really get some varied views on
That's true. Over the centuries, Jews and Christians have had varied views, and Pentateuch means the five books of Moses.
Yeah.
Yes.
You might want to say where all this is taking place, too.
Definitely.
It says in Shushan, the palace, chapter 1, verse 2. Shushan, where one of the capital cities, the chief cities of the Persian Empire, is located. Daniel has been there, and others, a number of our key figures in Scripture at this point.
It's almost due east of Babylon.
Right. So southwest
On the other
Iran.
just to the east of the
That's right.
Tigris and Euphrates rivers,
Right.
and what we call Iraq is that million square mile Iranian plateau. It's in the country we call Iran today, but Shushan, a lot of the concluding things in our Bible happened there.
Nehemiah will come from there.
And when they come back and rebuild the second temple, they're going to call that Eastern Gate the Shushan or Susa Gate, because it points in that direction toward where a lot of these biblical events.
Yes.
You wanted to comment about the
Kent's
name?
going to give us a quick overview of the
Susa.
name.
Well,
of
actually,
Shushan.
this name shows up in ancient Egyptian, and is still preserved in Hebrew and Arabic today, both in personal names and also referring to rose.
Shoshana?
And that's right, Shushan is the name. But one of the dimensions of this, Shushan, the palace, that in ancient Shushan there was an acropolis, where apparently the palace sat. And that's where these events take place.
Okay. So we turn to the first chapter of the book of Esther. We're introduced to the name of the king, Ahasuerus, in verse 1. Again, that form of his name does not appear anywhere else, but we think it's Xerxes the first. Verse 3, in the third year of his reign. So he comes to the throne 486, 485, so we're in the late 480s. And we are introduced to this gathering, and we're introduced in verse 9 to the name of the queen, Vashti, or Vashti. Gaye, help us out here. What transpires in chapter 1? It's an interesting situation.
Well, we have a banquet, maybe a pre-war banquet, and the king has lots of his buddies here and those who are going off, and they're all getting a little tipsy, and they invite Vashti, who is apparently a very beautiful queen, to come before them to entertain them, but she's not too well inclined to do that, and so she refuses, and that's not a good choice. It embarrasses the king, and there are some consequences for that.
So did she make a good choice?
I don't know.
That's a hard
in
question.
that day, probably not.
All right, we hear that in verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. He was very wroth. He starts taking suggestions on what should be done. There's this concern expressed in verse 17 that, boy, if you, the king, don't do anything to your wife who's refused to obey your command, then pretty soon that will be justification for every wife in the land to start disobeying the commands of their husbands. It's an interesting expression that we have here. And so what finally is concluded?
Well, that she should lose her title as queen.
Yeah.
Now, I think what's important that we need to understand, this wouldn't work very well in today's society. But in that day society, that's the way things were done.
Yeah, that's the way things
So
were done.
we want a new queen.
We want a new queen, and that
And
sets the
want
stage.
somebody who's pretty and
Yes,
obedient.
Yes, the emphasis here is on good-looking queens,
Queen
and
contest
somebody who will obey the king, and that sets the stage for the opportunity in the narrative for us to learn about Esther. Right? And so in chapter 2, we hear in verse 5 that there's a certain Jewish Israelite fellow living in Persia named Mordecai, and he's connected with the tribe of Benjamin. In verse 7, we hear that he is the cousin of a woman named Hadassah, and we know her as Esther.
Which means star in Persian.
Okay.
Hebrew Hadassah meaning myrtle, and Esther meaning star, yes.
Yeah.
It's kind of nice running through the book here.
And since her folks have passed away, Mordecai, is charged with raising Esther as if she were his own daughter. So what happens as the story progresses here?
Well, Mordecai shows his value in all of this, and his important place in the story is established very early on, because he learns of a plot against the king, and rather than keeping it to himself or becoming involved in this plot, he shows his loyalty to the crown by exposing it. But apparently, he's never rewarded properly, nor does anyone take proper note. Somehow that will come later on, during a sleepless night. We could call it sleepless in Susa, but at any rate, it's a sleepless night that he spends, and he finally comes to understand by reading some records that this little Jewish man was responsible for saving his life.
Yeah. Okay. We also hear in chapter 2 that he learns about the search for a new queen and makes arrangements for Esther to be considered as such. And so she is taken with a large group of other women into the palace and prepared and given the opportunity to come before the king. In verse 10, it says that actually Mordecai instructs her. We'll hear this several times. In verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it or make known her Israelite heritage. And that has a role to play in the story. It will be made known at the appropriate time, but at first she's not advertising that, so to speak. At the end of verse 15, Esther obtained favor in the sight of those who were helping to prepare her to be auditioned, so to speak. Verse 17, the king loved Esther above all the women that had been part of this contest, as we might call it, to see who the next queen will be.
And clearly here the beauty is an important part again. That's what attracts her. But I think in the story we see that there is some spiritual substance to Esther that enables her, in addition to her beauty, to carry out the Lord's will here.
Okay.
Outer and inner beauty.
All right. Well, at the beginning of chapter 3, we're then introduced to the last of the four main people that are part of the narrative of Esther, and that's Haman, or Haman, most people say. What do we know about Haman? What should we know about him here? How's he characterized?
Seems to be an anti-Semite. That comes out quickly. He doesn't like Jewish people.
Okay.
There may be an overlay of irony running through this too, or connections backwards. He's called an Agagite. Some have thought that he may be a descendant of King Agag, who was a king of a people called the Amalekites. You might remember that soon after the Hebrew slaves escaped Egypt, that an Amalekite army attacked them. This is according to Exodus chapter 17.
Yes.
That there had been enmity between the Amalekites and the Israelites for a very long time. And this man may be a descendant of this people, and that by mentioning his heritage, that he's an Agagite, there may be an attempt to show that there's a connection back genealogically to this people that possesses enmity for Israelites.
Okay.
But there's also this fact that Mordecai isn't going to show him the respect that he feels that he deserves.
Right. Before we leave Kent's comment, that gets played out in 1 Samuel 15, where Saul, the king of Israel, is sent to kill a group of Amalekites, destroy them, and brings back the king, whose name is Agag, and some of the flocks. And Samuel says, you haven't followed the instruction of the Lord. Saul, of course, is from Benjamin. Mordecai in this story is from Benjamin.
Connections.
And so some people have wondered about that, if that's some sort of a cultural heritage that should be considered. Well, yeah, I think it's important that we read chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Kelly, do you want to read those for us? Because that really sets the stage for what's going to happen here.
After these things, this is 3:1, did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence.
Okay, so word's coming back to Haman that this Mordecai fellow who sits at the king's gate isn't giving Haman appropriate respect, honor due him now with his high appointment. And so Haman, as we've mentioned, devises a plot to not only get rid of Mordecai, but to do harm to
in a sense,
his people.
verse 13 says, letters were sent to destroy, to kill, to cause to perish all Jews, both young, old, little children, women, in one day. This is an extermination order. Sounds like Herod or Lilburn Boggs or others from history.
Okay, and to determine when they're going to do this,
They're going to cast lot,
they
That's
cast
right.
lots.
which is the word poor, which is going to be important later
And
on.
we have that in chapter 3, verse 7. They cast poor. It's capitalized here. It doesn't need to be at this point. That is the lot to get some divine involvement about when this should all be carried out. And we'll see how this comes out later in the story. Kent?
Well, I was going to say that the plural of pur, the Hebrew plural of pur, is purim, and that becomes then the title of the festival, which celebrates the events in this book.
Okay, and maybe when we get to the end of our time, we'll say a couple of things about Purim, because it's still celebrated today,
Yes.
2,500 years later. All right, well, as you mentioned, Haman sends out letters with the name of the ring, the stamp seal of the king, to make sure that they're authentic, they're legitimate, and the posts. The Persians were famous for their postal system. The postmen carry these letters throughout the provinces that on a particular day, everyone who's Jewish, chapter 3, verse 13, the letters were sent by post to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to cause to perish. If one wasn't enough, all three, right? All the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, and the day is set. And
I was going to say that these verses also allow us a tiny glimpse into the inner workings of government.
yeah,
That is, that Haman, in the name of the king, is able to write a letter which carries the king's seal, goes out to everyone. Later on, Mordecai, who will replace Haman, also writes a letter in the name of the king. Whether the king exercised the right of review, we don't know, but it's interesting that here there are people with scribal skills who write in the name of the king.
right. Yeah, definitely part of that cultural background that's going on here. Well, as it turns out in chapter 4, Mordecai learns about what has happened. Is that correct?
Yes.
He does. And he's very concerned. In fact, we hear about him weeping, wailing, crying, rending his clothes in chapter 4, verse 1. And pretty soon other people have heard about it. Chapter 4, verse 3, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes because of their knowledge of what has been commanded concerning them. And that brings us then to the fact that Haman approaches, no, I take that back, Esther. Mordecai approaches Esther, who is the queen, says, you need to do something to help not only your people, but perhaps yourself as well. And this is probably one of the most famous or often quoted passages in the book of Esther. We're in chapter 4, beginning with verse 13 and 14.
But it's interesting, Dana, what she did. She fasted and prayed and dressed herself nicely, and she didn't go in to criticize or fighting or dictating, and no tears. She just comes in and invites him to dinner. She serves him, and just nicely setting up the situation where to allow him to make the decision of what will happen when it's revealed.
Right. Let's pick up chapter 4, 13 and 14 to get the point there, and then certainly we're going to have to develop the point that Kelly made. Verse 13, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, they're sending messages, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house. Just because you're the queen doesn't mean that eventually you're not going to suffer the same consequence that's been decreed for the Jews. Verse 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enslavement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And then this line that's so well known, and who knows whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this. What's he saying there? And does that have any application for any of us today?
Well, it appears that in Mordecai's view at least, and I think we would agree, that Esther has been moved into her place for this moment. By the Lord.
Okay.
That even though God is not mentioned here, certainly Mordecai assumes that, and I think we would see a divine hand in Esther's placement in high position to be able to influence policy in the kingdom.
Okay. We see that elsewhere in the scriptures. Who else?
Joseph.
Joseph in
the
Egypt
Lord
at
had
the end of
put
Genesis.
him in position.
Daniel certainly
That's right.
has some
And
involvement.
Moses. The Lord had maneuvered Moses into position to be able to
And
deliver
who knows,
the people.
but maybe many of us, not maybe on such a grand scale, but in certain times and places, the Lord has worked things out so that we can be influential.
I've seen that in a number of cases in various countries in recent years, how the Lord has raised up somebody that's going to help the cause of the kingdom in that part of the world. To see it all the time.
If they're faithful, the Lord will work through them and can work through them.
Well, I've seen that in my life. I can pinpoint 3 or 4 significant people in my life who, if they hadn't been there, my life could have taken a very different turn. And so it doesn't have to be a king or a political leader. I think it can be a Sunday school teacher or a primary teacher who can have a
Yes.
huge impact on someone as they're coming through. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us from Esther, that we don't have to be queens to do this. We can do it whatever our sphere and station is.
Okay, good. Well, the very last few verses of chapter 4, as Kelly's mentioned, Esther asks the Jews to fast for her, and she fasts herself. And then, as she says at the end of verse 16, I'm going to go in, and if I perish, I perish. But essentially, I've prepared myself spiritually, and I'll put myself in the hands of the Lord. I'll trust that if He wants something to work out, then He'll bring it about.
That's a wonderful concept there. If I perish, I perish. Or maintaining integrity and loyalty, we might say in modern terms, if I'm fired, I'm fired. Or if I'm not accepted to this, I'm not accepted, but I'm going to do what's right, what I feel in my heart is right.
We've heard this elsewhere in Daniel, for example. His 3 friends that won't bow down are going to be thrown into the fiery furnace, and they say, well, if God saves us, okay. If not, do what you want. We're not going to bow down. Right?
No matter what happens. Yes.
Well, as Kelly's mentioned, when we get to chapter 5, we now are to the point where the process of undoing Haman's decree is underway. And Esther has lunch with the king and Haman, and then says, let's have a dinner. And so Haman's feeling pretty good. The king's, I'm invited to dinner with the queen and the king. This is nice.
The queen has specifically asked for him to be there.
And she specifically says, yes, please come. And so in the process of that, we're kind of moving along through the narrative line here. Chapter 5, verse 14 is before he goes to dinner, he's talking to his wife, whose name is mentioned, Zeresh, and some of his friends, and they say, you ought to build a gallows, hang this Mordecai fellow who's being so disrespectful to you, and really make this a public display. Let that be a lesson to them, kind of a thing.
Because I think verse 13 is important here in the context of verse 14. Haman is going to say, all of this show availeth me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. So, that's what's motivating what the people are saying here.
Yeah. All right, well, chapter 6, this is that night before supper the next day that Kent has already mentioned, and the king couldn't sleep. And so he says, hey.
Maybe the result of that united fast.
I think that's the implication of the book here. And so, as Kent, you want to re-mention that quickly, and then we'll move on with what the
the king was unable to sleep on one night, so he asked for a certain set of records, discovers Mordecai's loyalty to him, and decides that this has to be rewarded in some grand way. So Haman shows up, apparently early for work, and the king consults him, asks him, what would you do for someone who had saved your life, who had performed some noble task on behalf of the king and the realm?
Well, if it was me, I'd want a coat from the king and a horse to ride on and all of those kind of things.
And that's exactly what Haman says, of course. And then the king assigns Haman to find Mordecai and to honor him in this way by parading him through the street and so on, which was just devastating to this man.
Imagine Haman's feelings.
So Haman has to then do for Mordecai what he thought was going to happen to himself, and that begins a series of ironic events here. The banquet is held, and chapter 7, as part of the banquet, it's revealed by Esther to King Ahasuerus what Haman has been plotting. And of course, the king is very upset by this. Chapter 7, verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy of my people is this wicked Haman. And Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. He sees the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. And by the end of chapter 7, at the king's order, Haman has been taken out and hanged on the gallows that he had ordered to have built for Mordecai.
Can I just say something here about verse 8? Because when the king is out, it says that Haman was fallen on the bed of Esther. Probably what we're talking about here is that they reclined at the banquets, and he's gone
on their dinner couches, not in the bedroom, so to speak.
That's right.
But he's a little too close.
That's right.
Yes. Okay, good point.
I suspect that he's come to her asking for mercy.
Right.
But it was simply the wrong thing to do because the king sees it as approaching his queen.
Inappropriate advances towards the queen. Well, now that Haman is out of the way, in chapter 8, King Ahasuerus gives Mordecai an important appointment, and letters are now sent out, another round of letters to all the provinces to say, we're not going to kill the Jews, nullify that previous order. They're sent out with the king's seal to make them authorized, authentic, and
Well, are they're not going
we
to clean
have
the shoes?
we have to
Okay.
wrap this up pretty quickly, and we often get that far and stop, thinking, oh, everything's happy. Kent, can you just help us out with chapter 9? What happens and why? And then we're going to have to wrap this up.
The Jewish people in the realm take their vengeance out on people who have wronged them. They're allowed to now by law. It's a law. It's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is the sort of justice that is seen, for instance, in Daniel. Daniel goes into the lion's den because of accusation of others. When he survives the night, he's proven to be innocent. That means that those who have accused him, therefore, are guilty and are to receive the same penalty. So it is, those who have maimed Jews now suffer maiming, and so on.
All right, and so there is a revenge of sorts taken against a number of these people. Well, as we know, the lot is cast, and Pur meaning lots, Purim, becomes the name of a Jewish holiday that extends, as we've already said, up to the present, every year celebrating how the Lord protected and delivered the Israelites, the Jews, back in that day. From Latter-day Saint perspective, he's still watching over and going to help deliver and gather the Israelites in our own day.
For more information on this program, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org.